Hello everybody and welcome to today's session, which is part of the Cambridge Live experience, and the topic is differentiation when returning to the classroom and the strategies that teachers can use to support their learners. My name's Miranda Hamilton and I work as exam support manager for the schools team. Now, presenting this session today, we have Monica Poulter. Monica has worked for many years at Cambridge Assessment English, supporting teachers' professional development, and she's now teaching online. Now, like most of you, we're working from home, but we're aiming to give you the best experience we can. We are relying on home Wi-Fi, so please bear with us if you have any issues. Now, before we start, there are a few suggestions to help you get the most out of today's session. We try to recommend that you use headphones. Now, this will help you get a better quality audio, so you'll hear better. Try not to have anything else running, especially Skype. So switch off any programs if you can. Don't worry if the picture is a little bit blurry at first. That's just the live streaming, and it should hopefully improve. Now, important this, during the webinar, you'll need to be able to use the chat box. It's on the right of the screen. Please use the chat box if you want to type any comments. And please use the Q&A box, which is a separate box, if you want to write any questions for the presenter for the end of the session. Now, this is if it's something we can answer straight away, then we'll type an answer to you. We'll keep some of the questions ready for the Q&A session, the question and answer session, at the end. So please don't worry if your question isn't answered straight away. We might ask you to use the chat box or polls for different activities during the session. So let me hand over to oh, hang on, one more thing. We're going to be issuing a certificate at the end of the session, and the certificate and the link to the recording will be sent to you after the session. There's usually a lot of questions about that. So without further ado, let's get started. Over to you, Monica.
Okay, so thanks. So today, welcome everybody. It's good to see so many people here, and I hope you are not suffering from Zoom fatigue. It's been a long day and there's been such interesting sessions. I've looked at quite a few of them myself, and I've noted quite a few to look at afterwards. So thank you for joining me. So what I'm going to be talking about is differentiation in mixed ability classes. And differentiation is simply using different techniques and strategies to ensure that all our learners experience success. That's what it's all about, that every learner should feel that they've achieved. And mixed ability classes, well, all our classes are mixed ability because every learner is different. So, and I think as people return to the face-to-face classroom, we're going to be noticing that those differences are greater than ever, that the gap between learners is going to be more evident because people have had different opportunities for learning during lockdown, which a lot of people have said. So today we're going to be looking at the challenges teachers face when teaching classes with mixed abilities and other differences, because of course there are lots of differences between learners, and we'll be talking about those in a minute. We're going to be looking at practical solutions when planning lesson content for a range of lesson types, so receptive skills lessons and productive lessons. And then we're going to consider classroom management options, so managing pair and group work in an inclusive way to make sure that every learner is learning. And then really importantly, I think the use of teacher language as a source of differentiation. So differences between individuals, we've already talked about differences in ability. And there are lots of other differences, and I wonder if you would like to just take a moment to think about the differences in your learners. What differences are there in the learners that you teach? So think about learners that you're teaching now, thinking about learners you've had in the past. So think about ways in which they differ, and can you share your comments in the chat box, please? Great. I mean, there's lots of fantastic things there. Educational background, ages, literacy skills, cultural understanding, traits, yeah. In fact, your list is going to be even more interesting than mine, I think. So these are some of the things that I picked out, and lots of you have added more things there, such as cultural understanding. And I think, you know, is the last one here, the progress during lockdown. As many people have said, there's been a big difference between the digital haves and the digital have-nots. You know, people who've been able to access online learning and people who haven't. And indeed, teachers have had the challenge too, because they've had to maybe switch from face-to-face classing to online learning in ways they haven't done before. So before we go on, I'd like to think about what you already know and feel about differentiation. So we've got a poll here, and I'd like you to choose A, if you already include differentiation tasks and activities in every lesson. B, if you would like to include more differentiation in your lessons, but you don't know how. C, if you're required to use the same materials with the whole class, which some people think prevents them from differentiating. And D, if you don't use differentiation techniques and strategies because they take up too much time. So could you choose A, B, C, or D, please? Okay, so could we perhaps have the result of that poll, please? Okay, so we've got quite a few people saying A, 31% of you. That's great, and I hope you'll be sharing some of your ideas during the task, because I know that there's lots and lots of ideas out there. B, you'd like to do more, but you don't know how. That's the point of this session, and I hope that you'll get quite a few takeaways from this session, either from what I say and from what other people share with you. Not many of you have to required to use the same materials as the whole class, which is good. And not many of you are saying that they take up too much time. I'm surprised at that one, because very often people say that differentiation does take time. And some strategies, in fact, do, but we're going to be focusing a lot today on ones that don't. So we're going to look first at reading and listening, the receptive skills. So you may have a class, in fact, you most certainly do have a class where reading differences are there in your class. You've got Group A, who are fast readers. They enjoy reading and they've got a good vocabulary. You've got Group B, who can manage the task quite well. Group C, who have less vocabulary and read quite slowly. And Group D, who don't enjoy reading and tend to disrupt the class. And our problem here is, how can teachers engage all the learners in the class using the same text, but keeping the learners engaged for the whole lesson? What options do teachers have? We're going to be looking at 3 different strategies. First one is trying to reduce or increase the challenge of the text, because remember, we're not only talking about learners that need more support, but learners who need more challenge. The second strategy is adapting the task, so making the task either more challenging or easier. And the third strategy is looking at the number of tasks, either increasing or decreasing the number of tasks. So let's start off by looking at text challenge, and let's look at a task. So you've got a reading task, and your task is that there are 8 short descriptions of different cycling courses, and then you've got 5 descriptions of people who want to take a course. So for example, you might have a learner who's just got their new bike, has never ridden before, and they want a course on how to ride safely. And one of the descriptions is a beginner's course on learning how to cycle safely on the road. So that's your text, and then your task is to match the person to the course. So what can we do to help slow readers? Can you write your suggestions in the text in the chat box? What can you do to support learners who find that text too challenging? They read very slowly and they need a bit of support. Great. Some of you are saying reduce the number of text, use visuals, pre-teach keywords, have them work in pairs. Fantastic. Very good ideas there. Okay, so as many of you have said, one of the things that you can do is to reduce the number of descriptions that are used. So instead of reading 5 descriptions, instead of reading 8 descriptions, the learners read 5 descriptions. You could reduce the number of people who are looking for a course. So in this way, you're reducing the amount of text that has to be read. You could make it a little bit more challenging by reducing the task to 6. So there are 6 descriptions and you have to match 5 learners to 5 descriptions. What you have to remember is that if you have given that support, you need to have something in mind for the more proficient readers. So more proficient readers need to have an extension task. So in this instance, for example, you could give them a task where they have to describe a course that they would like to do, or maybe send a WhatsApp message to a friend, telling the friend about the course and asking the friend to do the course with them. You could allow learners to use a dictionary. That can be very helpful. You need to let the stronger readers try to guess the meaning of words from context. You could provide the vocabulary for the learners. You could provide translations of key vocabulary. You could simply give more time. Lots of you mentioned the idea of using pictures and the idea of pre-teaching some words and stimulating interest in the text. And these were very important points, because if you look at the reader in this picture, the child is engrossed in the text and they're reading because they're interested in the text and because they want to read. And so often the text in our course books might be topics that aren't of interest to the learners. So a very important stage is to engage learners in the text. Lots of you mentioned using pictures. So using pictures is a great way to stimulate interest in the text. You can elicit vocabulary, and again, you can use your stronger learners to do that. You can get them to, you can personalize the text. You can ask them if they've got a bike, how they learn to ride a bike, where they ride a bike, do they ride their bike to school, are they allowed to ride their bike on hillsides and in the countryside, as we can see in the picture here. So engaging people in that text is a really important process, and many of you mentioned that. One option you have is to give the learners different texts. Now, your course book may have different texts on the same topic, and giving learners different texts and getting them to read different things and then share information is called jigsaw reading. And jigsaw tasks involve reading different texts and then sharing that information afterwards. Now, of course, an easy strategy is just to give the more proficient readers the more complex task or the longer task. But be careful, because the longer task doesn't necessarily mean the more challenging. A shorter task might in fact be more complex. So be very careful and make sure that you're giving the more challenging task to the stronger readers. You might think, and many teachers feel, that it's not a very good use of class time to use that time for reading. And I think this is especially the case at the moment, where many of us are teaching online. To go onto Zoom and to spend that time reading a text is probably not the best use of time, because Zoom classes tend to be a bit shorter than face-to-face, because you get Zoom fatigue very easily, and Zoom online lessons are more demanding. So one thing to consider here is the flipped classroom. So when you're using the flipped classroom, in the normal classroom, you will set classwork and then you will go on to do the homework. In the flipped classroom, what you're doing first is to set the classwork, set some work to, before classwork, set some homework. So for example, when we were talking about the reading session, you could set that task before the class, then come to the class to do the classwork, and then do some follow-up work afterwards. In the flipped classroom, you're doing that homework at home, then coming to the class, and then you're doing the follow-up work afterwards. If you're teaching online, we can use a similar strategy. We can do our classwork, set the task. So for example, in the reading task that we were talking about, we can stimulate vocabulary, we can stimulate ideas in the text, and then we can read the text at home, and then we can come back to the class for extension. So in the online class, you can do the same thing, have a short online class where you set the tasks, elicit ideas for the task, engage learners in the text, get them to read it at home, and then come back to the online task. Many of the ideas that we've talked about, looking at text challenge, looking at adapting tasks, and looking at increasing the number of tasks, those ideas can be used for listening as well. So let's now look at a listening task. If you have a group of learners who aren't very good at listening, you've got a task here where there are 5 teenagers who are going on a trip. So the task is that the speakers have to, there are 5 speakers and they all have an experience of a trip, and you've got to match the speaker to their experience of the trip. How can you make this task less challenging for the people who find listening very difficult? So 5 speakers and then comments about their trip. Okay, lots of you are saying that you can reduce the number of speakers, split the speakers. In fact, in this listening task, there are 3 girls and 2 boys. So one thing you could do is get some of the people to listen to all the girls and get some of the people to listen to all the boys. Again, if you do split the task, some listeners will be able to go on and complete all the listening. So for those people, you need to have an extension task. So a really nice extension task here would be to describe the worst trip you've ever been on with your family, or the best trip you've ever been on with your family. Or you could match ask which speaker had the best experience, which speaker had the worst experience. You may find that many of your learners have a spiky profile. So, for example, some may be much stronger in listening and speaking than they are in reading and writing. So what can you do if you have a learner who's very good at listening and speaking, but they're not so good at reading and writing? Many listening tasks require people to respond with a reading or writing exercise. So what can you do so that people can demonstrate their listening? Could you put your ideas in the chat box, please? Okay, visual activities, that's great. Giving extra work, using visuals is coming up, writing down simple words, visuals, pictures instead of text. Okay, that's great. Now, lots of you have mentioned choosing the correct visual. And if you are familiar with Key for Schools preparation or Key for Schools text, very often this is the kind of task that the young learners will do, school-age learners will do. So the task here is to choose the correct visual. Something else you could do is just tick what you hear. So for example, if you're describing a picnic, and your learners could just tick the words that the objects that were taken on a picnic. So apple and pear and sandwich. Something else you can do is to complete a frame, and we'll be talking about frames much later on. So if, for example, if the listening task is to a telephone conversation where you're agreeing a cinema trip, the frame could just be that you just complete the information about where to meet, when to meet, and what film you're going to see. Another thing that you can do is respond with a drawing, and this works really well if you have describing a place or describing a house or describing a person. You can simply draw the person or place. A nice activity if you're doing storytelling is to just identify the mistakes. So, for example, if you've done a story of Goldilocks and the 3 bears, and you've been reading the story and listening to the story, you can then read it out making deliberate mistakes. So, for example, Goldilocks went to a house, and in the house there were 2 bears. And then they said, no, there were 3 bears. They were eating their cornflakes. No, they were eating porridge. And young learners particularly love doing things where they have to spot the deliberate mistake. For learners whose reading and writing is stronger than their listening, one task that you can do there is to provide them with the transcript. Now, this activity is on the Cambridge English website, and it's an activity where people can listen to text and then they can view the text afterwards. So I would always encourage your learners to listen to the text first, because it's very important to develop your listening skills. But looking at the text afterwards can be a way of highlighting difficulties in listening, such as use of short forms in listening and elision in listening. So it can make learners aware of where their difficulties are. We're going to move on now to look about differentiation in writing activities. Now, there are 2 types of writing activity. One type of writing activity is simply to answer questions on reading comprehension text and listening comprehension text. But what we're talking about here is not that type of writing activity, but communicative writing activities. So communicative writing activities are things like, you know, writing an email or writing an essay for a class. So let's look at this task, which is an A2 Key for Skills sample paper task. The task is that you're going shopping with a friend, Pat. You've got to write an email to Pat. You've got to write where you want to meet, what time you want to meet, and what you want to buy. So how could you provide support for learners who would find that task too challenging? Okay, giving sample vocabulary, brainstorming, providing a model text, exactly, showing a sample, helping with useful phrases. There are lots of really guided writings and really good ideas there. Filling up gaps, giving them a model, using a mind map. Yeah, some fantastic ideas there. And lots of you have mentioned using a frame. So here's an example of a frame. So your poor writers might find it difficult to use those phrases to actually draft the whole email, but by giving them the key phrases and giving them gaps to fill in key information, you're providing them with lots of support. And as I've mentioned before, you need to think of your stronger writers here and have an extension task in line for them. So here, for example, you could get them to write another email to invite another friend to join the peer review. You could get them to look at the objects that they want to buy and get them to write adjectives to describe the objects that they've put. So for example, if they've said they want to buy some jeans, they could be encouraged to say, well, what kind of jeans? Skinny blue jeans. Or they could do that in pairs and do that for each other. At higher levels, you're going to have a more challenging task. And again, we've got the problem that using class time for writing might be not the best use of class time. So how could you make a task like this more interactive? So in this task, you've got to write a story. The task is to write a story for a magazine. You're on your way to school and you get a message on your phone. You've got to write a story, and the story must include a surprise and a bicycle. How could you make that task more interactive? Yeah, lots of you have mentioned doing a group task, creating a mind map, a collaborative task, write only the beginning and then you have to complete it. That's a fantastic idea. Reviewing peer's story. We've obviously got some very experienced people in this session, some fantastic ideas there. And I really like the idea of making a writing activity into an interactive task. So you can get the learners to write the story in pairs. Obviously that's more difficult to do in the face-to-face classroom now because you can't sit closely together, but you can do it online easily in breakout rooms, or you could do it on a Google Doc, for example, a shared Google Doc. So to write the story in pairs and to give an evaluation sheet. Lots of you have mentioned collaborative writing. And if you give an evaluation sheet, you can swap the story with another pair and they can evaluate the story, send it back to the first pair who can then improve it. So that's a fantastic way of making the writing task interactive. You can also develop this kind of activity into a speaking task. So with this particular task, for example, you could put your learners into editorial teams, and as editors, they have to decide which story is best and which story should be selected to go into the magazine. Or if you've got a large class, you can maybe choose the best 3 stories. So just to sum up that, here, for example, first is an example of evaluation. This again is from the Cambridge English website. There's a lesson on writing evaluation criteria, but you can easily make your own depending on what you want to focus on or what problems that your learners have. Some of you are suggesting using Wakelet, Edpuzzle. Fantastic ideas there as well. Different students give a sentence to make up the story. Okay, using Padlet, yeah, posting stories on Padlet. Padlet might be a bit long to, the story might be a bit too long to put on Padlet. Okay, writing a mini saga, so it could be the first part of a serial. That's a fantastic idea. Okay, so just to sum up that, use pair and group work for preparation evaluation, provide checklists, swap, evaluate and make suggestions, and then create a speaking activity. I mentioned at the beginning that some writing activities are simply writing in response to a grammar exercise or a reading comprehension task. You can differentiate here. So in this example, for example, you've got a boy who's fixing his skateboard. You could have some learners have to simply describe the picture, what he's doing. Another group of learners could simply do gap fill exercise, so completing the gap. And a third group could simply reorder the words. So let's move on now to differentiation for speaking activities. Common speaking activity, of course, is role play. And let's look at this role play. A teacher is organising a visit and the pupils have to agree on which place to go to. So there are 4 choices: local science museum, a picnic by a lake, a football stadium and a wildlife park. And you've got 4 roles here: Maria, Karim, Barbara and Peter. Now, which role would you allocate to a student who's not very confident about speaking? Would it be Maria, Karim, Barbara or Peter? Lots of you are saying Barbara. Most of you are saying Barbara. A couple of people are saying Karim. A lot of you are saying Karim, but most people are saying Barbara. I think for me, Barbara is the easiest one because she's got no particular wish. She just wants to be with her friends, and whatever her friends want to do, she will do as well. One problem with allocating a role where people might not have to say very much is that that person doesn't say very much. And if what you're doing is trying to develop your learners' speaking skills, it's a bit of a problem. But what you can do there is allocate tasks to the people in the role play. So, for example, one person could be somebody who makes sure that everybody in the group speaks. So somebody could be tasked with saying, well, everyone in the group must speak 3 times. And that way you don't get the problem that somebody doesn't say anything. And I think the important thing is just to make sure that Barbara is included. She might be very shy and not very good at speaking, but if you just include her and make sure she says something, and I think that can be a really kind of positive experience for Barbara. Using pictures is one of the favourite things that I like to do because pictures are so versatile, because you can simply name the objects in the picture. So you can use that very low level class. You can describe the colours in the picture. You can describe what's going on in the picture. So for example, here we've got the girl, she's sitting on the bench. There's a pigeon who's flying near the bench. There's a lady walking across the park. It doesn't look like it's a sunny day. It looks like a dull day. You can use this interpretation of the story, so you could say, who is the girl, why is she there, how old is she, what is she feeling, what's just happened, what's going to happen next. So you can create a whole story around this. So pictures are really, really versatile. Somebody mentioned in the last presentation on differentiation the use of Jamboard, and that's something that I've been using recently. And then you can select pictures there and your learners can choose pictures and you can create activities around those. One thing that learners like to do is bring in their own pictures. So you could get people to bring in a picture of maybe their favourite pet or the favourite object, and you can get them to then do an activity with that picture. It could be something on their phone. If you allow use of phones in class, they put their favourite picture on their phone. And again, we've talked a lot about using a frame. So we used a frame for listening tasks. We used a frame in the writing activity. And here you can provide a frame so that for a lower level class, they know what they've got to do. So learner A asks a question, learner B answers the question, learner A then comments on the question, and then learner B provides an extra comment. So here's an example of that. So this is my cat, what's his name? Felix, he looks intelligent. And you can extend that. You can do it over and over. Ask another question. Learner B asks a question, and learner A answers the question, and learner B makes a comment. So make a statement, ask a question, answer a question, and make a comment. And you can use any picture for that. And it's a way of personalising the topic. I think one way of including all the learners is to personalise it.
Monica,
Yeah.
I've got a little question for you.
Yeah.
We're now at 5:33 and we've got very little time. So if we can...
Can I just go through I want to go through very quickly because the last bit I think is one of the most important parts, Miranda. So if I could just very quickly, some speaking practice you'll want to do whole class repetition, especially if you're practicing grammar. If you look at this picture, there's a boy who's got his hand up, everybody else is looking. So one way of doing whole class repetition is to say, let's all the boys repeat, all the girls repeat, table 4 repeat, table 6 repeat, row C, row A. Say it loudly, softly, angrily, happily, sleepily, in a tired voice, in a bored voice, sing it, rap it. You can do that again for role play, get people to rehearse the role play over and over, and that way you get lots and lots of repetition. We're going to look very quickly now at classroom management, organising pairs and groups. You can have pairs of groups of strong learners together, less proficient learners together. If you've got strong learners together, you can leave them to work alone. They will support each other. You can then focus on the less proficient learners. You can mix groups of varying abilities. That works well if people get on well together in the class. You can mix pairs with a strong learner matched with a less proficient learner. You can use think, pair and share activities if you have a large class. So think individually, go into a pair and then share your activity with the rest of the class. Finally, I just want to say something very quickly about use of teacher language, because teacher language is so important. If we look at this activity, we've got, imagine they have just read a text on Greta Thunberg, the Swedish activist. You're going to ask questions. Which one is the most easiest question? We haven't got time to do this in the chat box, but if you look here, you might have identified already that question 3 is the easiest question. Did she go by plane? Yes, she did, or no, she didn't. It's a yes/no question. The most difficult question is what you think of her actions, because you have to give your own opinion. Where did she go last year? The information's in the text. It's a short answer. Why did she go there? A longer answer, but the answer's in the text. So using open and closed questions and asking the easier questions to the less confident learners. And a final point, just when you're responding to what learners say in the class, when you ask a question, give thinking time. Very often we ask a question and we take the answer too quickly. So the cleverest learner has answered the question and the others have not been given the opportunity. So count maybe up to 7 seconds, and then nominate after you've asked the question. So don't nominate first, because otherwise all the learners go to sleep. So nominate and then ask somebody to answer the question. Don't always affirm the correct answer. Involve other learners. So somebody gives you the answer and you just ask the other learners, is she right? Do you agree? And then everybody's got a chance to think. And the final thing is challenge the person even who answered. So you might have got the correct answer from the very clever learner, but try saying, are you sure? And you might find very often the learner will change their mind, even though they have got the correct answer. But using that "are you sure" means everybody has got the chance to think. So I'm sorry that last bit was quite rushed, because it is actually one of the most important differentiation strategies that I know. So anyway, I hope that you've got some takeaways from the session. And Miranda, have we got any time for questions?
We have, and we've got some fantastic questions come through, actually. One of the questions that I think is really helpful is, how can you stop students feeling that they've been asked to do different activities and then they may feel a little bit inferior, so they don't feel as good as the other learners? And that question's come in from Daniela, and it really is something I'd like to see what.
Yeah, I think, teachers used to have a table, where they would put all the learners with special learning difficulties together, and doing anything that makes learners feel inferior is not good. I think it's fair to say that learners do know who the good ones in the class are, and they do know the ones who are stronger and the ones who are weaker. So I think actually what you need to do is to encourage a very positive classroom environment. So at the beginning of your school year, many of you are at the beginning of a school year now, to actually devise a code, a classroom code, which means that, you know, everybody helps each other learn, you support other learners. And I think always kind of finding out what your learners are interested in and involving them in that way, and using warmers to hook people into the lesson to make sure that everybody participates. They don't feel they're the one who's not saying anything or they're the one who's not doing anything. But I think, you know, find out what each person's strengths are, know your learners. I mean, I think the most important thing about differentiation is knowing who your learners are. And, you know, if you know who they are, you'll be able to call on them, and maybe they've got a particular skill like drawing or singing or miming. And then you can include there, and they might be, you know, the cleverest person in the class when it comes to miming or drawing. And so they might not be so good at English, but they can be strong in other areas.
I've got another question, and this one has come in, and it's somebody who's got a really large class. So I've got 124 students. How can I manage differentiation tasks and still meet the needs of the syllabus? Can you offer any ideas?
With a large class, it's very difficult, and I think that what you have to do there is, in different classes, focus on different groups of learners. I think using your strong learners to support each other is crucial as well. So remember, you're not the only teacher in the room. You've got 100 people and you're not the only teacher there. You've potentially got, you know, 25 other teachers in the room. And I always remember my daughter saying that she learnt more German by helping one of her classmates with the German than she did by listening to the teacher. So use the other teachers in the room. I mentioned just at the end there, think, pair, share activities. And I've also seen think, pair, share, square, share, which is you get people to think individually, get them in a pair, then get that pair in another pair, and then get that group to give feedback. So yeah, large classes are most of these things you will find, you know, will work with large classes, but you need a little bit more thought beforehand.
Yes, so you need to really plan it, in fact, to think ahead as to how you can approach it. I think we've got time for one more question. Somebody has asked about how can we cope with faster finishes? Because again, that's a differentiation problem.
I think the fast finishers, as I said, you know, is always having an extension task ready, always something else to do. A productive skills task is very good, especially after reading and listening, is get them to do something productive. You know, like writing something, or and they can actually work with another person who's a fast finisher, preparing something together. I think, you know, something in response to a reading or a listening task, or some of people mentioned when we were looking at writing a story, that it could be a first part of a serial story. So you could say, well, you write the next part, what happened afterwards. So I think always having something up your sleeve.
Yes, it comes back to planning, doesn't it? But in many ways, thinking ahead as to how.
And sometimes you can have, like, you know, just a choice box where people can go and choose something to do. So some activities that are there, and you can go and select what you want to do. Giving choice is quite important as well. Saying, okay, you've finished that task, what would you like to do next? Would you like to do some reading? If you've got readers in the class, would you like some time to do prepare your homework?
Yes. One more question. What do you do if your learners are rather passive, by which I mean they don't really engage, and you want to get them involved? And what do you do about that for passive learners in the class? How do you do differentiation there?
Yeah, I think for passive learners, it might be because they're not feeling confident. So I think that you need to think of ways of engaging them in the class, and that could be, for example, through doing a game. I defy you to tell me a learner who doesn't like playing a game. So it could be a game where they don't actually have to speak. It could be like a miming game. As I said before, it could be that, you know, the person who's more passive is actually somebody who would be prepared to join in a miming game. So I think trying to, and getting to know your learners, getting to know kind of what interests them. So if you find something that interests them, so if you can relate it, personalization, I think, is one of my key strategies. If you know that learner, then you can find something which is of interest to them, and then they will speak. Using pair work and individual work, you know, trying to give them individual feedback. That's why I think kind of the online environment sometimes can be quite useful, because you can put that person into a breakout room. You can send them little chat messages, you know, individual chat messages, you know, where you like, you know, give them, maybe feed in an idea or suggest that they do something, and the other learners don't know. So very often passive can just be about being shy.
Yes, it can be. Yes, that's true. Well, that's as many questions. Well, we have got other questions, but there are so many of them. We haven't got time to cover them today. So I think we're there. Now, thank you. Without further ado, I'd just like to say thank you so much, Monica, for all of your very informative session. Really useful ideas, useful slides, and very, very useful as we return back to learning from such a long period out of the classroom.
So good luck, everybody, because it certainly is challenging getting back to the classroom. And I know that, you know, in many places it's going to be stop-start, isn't it? You're going to start your classes and then it's going to be, you know, stop again because there's been cases of the virus. So the best of luck to you. And, you know, I think sharing with other teachers, I mean, I haven't mentioned that much, but, you know, if you do develop materials, especially things like jigsaw reading tasks, or share it with other teachers, support each other. I think that's the most important thing.
Okay, all right. So I think the next, did you finish all your slides, Monica, or have we got some more that we need to, so it's questions and then there's a thank you slide, is there?
No, that was just the summary of the session, which I thought we didn't need to do as we were running out of time.
Okay, well, that's absolutely lovely. So thank you everybody for attending, and please join us through the rest of the week because we've got lots of really lovely sessions coming up. So tomorrow's the last day. Take a look at the programme and please come and see if there's something there that's interesting for you, and come and join us tomorrow. Thank you very much, Monica.